How's everyone doing? Welcome to WBUR City Space. My name's Alex Schnepson. I am Events and Programming Manager here. And to those of you who have been here before, welcome back. To those who are joining us for the first time, thank you for coming. Just a few things to get out of the way before the conversation starts. You can stay in the loop with everything we're doing here by signing up for our newsletter and by checking out our full lineup at wbur.org/cityspace, as well as following us on Twitter and Instagram at WBUR Cityspace. We're here tonight in recognition of Veterans Day and in support and recognition of all that our troops and veterans do, but also to highlight a specific and important topic: the wounds of the war on terror. We're grateful for our partnership with the New York Times, who put this panel together and who have been very supportive and instrumental in putting together a number of events that we've done here so far. So for a bit more context about what you are going to hear tonight, please welcome the editor of the New York Times at War channel, Lauren Katzenberg.
Good evening. Thanks for being here. I just want to thank WBUR for this partnership and the New York Times events team who puts together all of these great events. My name is Lauren. I'm the editor of the At War channel, which is a forum for exploring the experiences and costs of war. If you're not familiar with this channel on the Times, you can go to nytimes.com/atwar for more information, and you can sign up for our weekly newsletter there. Since 2001, trauma medicine has made unprecedented breakthroughs, with the military treating troops with skills and confidence not seen before in the history of warfare. But these advances have had to contend with complex injuries that now define combat in the 21st century. Designed by ever-evolving irregular fighting forces, a new generation of weapons, such as I.E.Ds, has killed or injured thousands of troops in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. We've gathered this panel here tonight in the hub of medical innovation and healthcare to discuss these combat wounds and how they've pushed medical practitioners to rethink trauma care and long-term healing. So to start tonight, you'll hear from Dr. Dave Lounsbury, an internal medicine physician. He served in the Army Medical Corps and deployed to both Gulf Wars. Then in 2003, he deployed as deputy commander of the 10th Combat Support Hospital in Kuwait and Iraq. Before and after these deployments, Dave was attending physician, chief of internal medicine, teacher of the year, and director of the Borden Institute at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. He is also the author of Emergency War Surgery and War Surgery in Afghanistan and Iraq. Captain Gregory Galeazzi is a retired infantry officer who deployed to Kandahar, Afghanistan in the summer of 2010 with the Army's 4th Infantry Division. In May 2011, Greg was heading back to base with his platoon when he was severely injured by an improvised explosive device. Today, he's in his 3rd year at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Alexis Iaccarino is the clinical director of traumatic brain injury and brain health services at the Massachusetts General Hospital and Red Sox Foundation home-based program and is a faculty member in the Harvard Medical School and Spaulding Rehab Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation. She specializes in the evaluating, treating, and providing rehabilitation interventions for people with concussion and traumatic brain injury, with a focus on military service members and athletes. And our moderator tonight is Chris Chivers. He's a long-form writer and investigative reporter who works for the New York Times Magazine. He is also the author of The Gun and the Fighters, Americans in Combat. His Pulitzer Prize-winning cover story for the magazine in 2016 led to the release from an Illinois prison of an Afghan war veteran suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And on that note, I'll hand it over to Chris to begin the panel. Thank you.
I'd like to begin just thanking people for coming for a reason maybe you don't often get thanked for, but I've labored in the space of public discourse about war pretty much my entire adult life. And what I want to thank you for is giving a shit, for coming here, because a lot of times you work in this space and you find silence. Nobody much engages, and you're here, and it's not easy to get here, Boston traffic, and your busy lives, so thank you. I hope tonight we'll have a discussion here that is both blunt and illuminating and free of euphemism. War, stripped of its nostalgia, reduced to its final essence, is a collection of socially sanctioned crimes, trespasses upon others and upon property that in most all other contexts are so shocking and so damaging that they are universally prescribed. That's how large-scale organized violence works. And there's a corollary. War breaks human beings, and not in small quantities. It results in mass trauma of multiple sorts: physical, psychological, emotional, and moral. We expect that many of you in this audience possess an intimate first-hand understanding of recent issues related to the wounds of war. We're going to discuss these wounds forthrightly, and we're going to discuss some of the ways they've been documented, prevented, mitigated, and finally, when flesh and bone are torn and souls are shattered, how they've been treated, including here in and around Boston, a city with its own rich and complicated history of sending its sons and daughters to war and receiving them when they come home. We also assume that some of you are less familiar with what battlefields have wrought upon your fellow citizens, whether in Vietnam or, as we're here to talk about today, the war since the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in 2001. So we're going to begin with background, with a primer. And the first question I'm going to ask Dave, 2 seats over, who was one of the co-editors of this book, which is essentially a very graphic textbook, almost a catalog of the types of wars that became common and representative, typical of the wars of the last, I don't know, roughly 20 years. So we're going to open with you, Dave, for our background. Let's spend, if you will, several minutes providing the room with a brief overview of war trauma, what makes it different from common civilian injury, and what are the most common types of wounds, and maybe some survival rates comparing how people with these traumas fare now as opposed to yesteryear.
We're in downtown Boston, and the emergency rooms in this city of BU Medical Center, Mass General, Brigham, received trauma tonight, and that trauma is primarily blunt trauma, which would be motor vehicle accidents. Actually, the most common blunt trauma are falls, falling off a ladder, falling off a step stool. It's the food for lawyers. Happens all the time, and that's blunt trauma. It can be high-velocity blunt trauma in a motor vehicle accident, which can be very serious. Penetrating trauma in Boston tonight are stab wounds, gunshot wounds. Elsewhere in America, we're just beginning to see these mass casualties, but by and large, that's a tiny minority of the penetrating trauma that's seen. But the combat trauma that Chris Chivers just addressed is gruesomely, uniquely different. There's little comparison, and the reason is because it's not a gunshot wound or a burn or a single stab wound. It's what we call polytrauma. It's the polytrauma of blast, burn, and penetrating injury. The blast itself, all by itself, can shatter bone, can destroy organs, can kill outright. Or the blast can be associated, not or, but close enough, the blast is also associated with burn, which could be the thermal injury of the explosion itself, or it could be the fire that's invariably started afterwards. The firearm clothes, the soldier or the Marine's clothes lighting fire causes more of a burn. And the penetrating injury is the stuff that goes with the I.E.D. that Lauren mentioned, the shrapnel. If it isn't high-velocity bullets flying left and right, it's this high-velocity shrapnel that penetrates brain, torso, limbs, and what is necessarily true is it isn't one or another. It isn't a burn or a blast or a penetrating injury. They invariably occur at the same time in the same patient, a limb blown off his torso burned, and multiple shrapnel injuries. The end result of this, if it isn't death outright, is a massively injured casualty, but not one. They usually occur in groups, so you have a mass casualty of a half dozen or a dozen of polytrauma presenting to your medical facility all at the same time. It has a learning curve, and there's a process to get familiar and even remotely comfortable with that. Chris wants me to say something about the rate of success of the management. Later we'll talk about how this catastrophe is managed. But I, for one, find the discussion of rates of success of casualty management almost impossible to understand. But to suit Chris, I have some answers. We've improved, and we'll talk about that later this evening, but in the Civil War, if you weren't killed outright and you were recovered on the battlefield and presented to some sort of tented medical facility, the individuals who subsequently died, which is what this talk tonight is all about, were 12 to 14% of the Civil War. They made it to a medical facility and they succumbed afterwards, regardless of the care they got. In World War I, it had fallen to 8%. In World War II, it was 3.5% to 6.5%, but the variability was enormous. It depended on which theater you were in. Were you in the Pacific, where medical facilities were thousands of miles apart, or were you in Europe, where they were much closer? In Vietnam, it actually stayed about the same as the Second World War. It was 3.5%. In the first Gulf War, it was 2 to 3%, and in the war that we represent on the stage, it's still hovering around 3%. But I've already mentioned briefly the learning curve that was associated with that. At the beginning of the war in 2003, in Iraq, it was close to 10%. But these inexperienced surgeons that left states and presented themselves in a trauma resuscitative unit or a CASH or a MASH had to look at this, and I should almost stop there, and not know what to do. I stood in an EMT, emergency medical treatment facility, and saw my first casualty. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to start. I didn't know what to do. And because of that learning curve, the statistics of 10% at the beginning of the war plunged to 3% by 2006.
So another way of looking at that is, by later periods in the war, about 97% of the people who made it through the casualty evacuation to a field hospital, about 97% of them would survive.
Correct.
Alexis, let's get past the first few minutes. Dave was talking about the immediacy of trauma up to the point in which you reach a doctor. Let's go longer term. About 7,000, almost 7,000 Americans in uniform were killed during what we call now the global war on terrorism, principally in Iraq and Afghanistan. But let's talk about those who weren't killed, the survivors, the 97%. These are the wounded veterans who live among us now many years later. Some of them have been among us now almost 20 years, 15, 10, very common now. After their initial convalescent and treatment period, when they're discharged and returned to civilian life, many wounded troops, you know, those numbers are deceptive when you hear 97% make it if they reach the hospital. Many of them don't recover enough to return to their jobs. They never return to full duty, much less to their previous jobs. They've since departed the service. Often they're medically retired. Sometimes they get regular, what we think are regular non-medical discharge, but with a sliding scale of disability benefits. And they live among us. You know, they'll be here for 2 or 3 more generations. What do you see, Alexis, among the wounded veterans and their reintegration here in Massachusetts? And what sort of conditions are you commonly treating among veterans wounded across these many years?
Sure. I have the fortunate privilege to work at MGH, and we have a program there called Home Base, which is mostly dedicated to what we would term invisible wounds of war. But there are a myriad of injuries that people come back with from the war. Some of those can be readily apparent to people walking the street. Some of them are maybe only apparent to people who knew you well beforehand. And some of those may not be apparent to anyone but the service member. What we tend to see most and what we tend to treat most are those wounds that tend to not be readily apparent or didn't bring you to a hospital immediately. But as we've watched people return from war over time, we know that they may be equally impairing. And some of those injuries include mental health conditions, post-traumatic stress disorder, and traumatic brain injuries. Roughly 1 in 5 service members will develop post-traumatic stress disorder or depression. Those are nationwide numbers. And in my area of specialty, which is traumatic brain injury, there have been reported since the DoD really started counting, which they weren't counting initially, was over about 300,000 reported traumatic brain injuries. The really interesting part about this is that the overwhelming majority of those injuries fall in what we'd characterize as the mild category. So these are things that do not present you to medical attention initially. They may not even get you to come to medical attention in the subsequent days after the event, the subsequent weeks. It may actually not be for quite some time or till you return home that people notice some of the subtle differences that we associate with these sorts of injuries. But they're quite pervasive. And we're finding that particularly people who have suffered repetitive injury or have overlapping difficulties with both their mental health and neurological function are struggling to get back into the community, to get back to their job, to function in their role as a spouse or a caregiver. So we really we see a wide breadth of injuries in people coming back. Some of the more silent type injuries or ones that are just not so apparent can be equally difficult to treat and can be equally impairing, I think, as some others that are much more readily apparent. So we've just been fortunate enough to try to build a program where we try to bring awareness to these things and also to be able to design treatment paradigms and other things to address them for people. And we see that not uncommonly in our veterans and service members here in Massachusetts. They do a little bit better statistically than veterans in some other states and communities, and we're privileged to have a lot of medical resources here in Massachusetts, particularly in Boston. But there's still a significant number of folks who are suffering.
Greg, now's the time to go from the broad to the narrow to the personal. Can you tell us about your experience as an Army infantry lieutenant? In a nutshell, what happened?
Sure. So, just to summarize, basically, I was commissioned through Army ROTC in 2007, assigned to be an infantry officer, and after about a year or so of initial training, reported to my first duty station out in Fort Carson, Colorado, part of the 1st Brigade Combat Team, 4th Infantry Division. It wasn't long after that that our unit was tasked to deploy to Kandahar, Afghanistan for a 12-month deployment in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. we left in the summer of 2010. And actually, initially at the time of the deployment, at the start of the deployment, I was a member of a small team in Kandahar City that was basically a liaison element to Afghan security force leadership, helping to sort of guide them and train them. And then, unfortunately, about a month into the deployment, one of the nearby units suffered a devastating attack from a roadside bomb, and the result was the loss of a 24-year-old lieutenant who was a platoon leader, and the same blast also claimed the life of the senior squad leader in the platoon. This was so early into the deployment, and as we all know, wars don't stop when people get killed. And this unit had just lost two of their most essential leaders, and they had a long ways to go. And I really wasn't happy with my current position. Being an infantry officer in a war zone, basically doing a desk job would make you go crazy. So I volunteered to take over the platoon and was granted that assignment. And so I reported within a matter of days after that happened, and started integrating into a platoon that had already known each other, had already sort of formed bonds before the deployment, and had gone through some hard times already. But luckily, I couldn't have asked for a better group of soldiers to work with. They accepted me, and basically we got assigned. Our mission was, we were in a rural farmland outside of Kandahar City that had largely been ignored by security forces for the previous 9 years or so. And what it turned into was basically a safe haven for insurgent activity, to store weapons caches, to sort of manufacture IEDs, and then be able to easily sneak into the city, stage these large-scale attacks, and then easily retreat back into the more rural farmland. And our mission was basically to reclaim this territory and to clear the roadways, the farmlands, and the houses that had largely been abandoned by the local nationals out of fear for booby traps and unexploded ordnance and things like that. And so we did our job. We did it well, and had a lot of positive response as far as a counterinsurgency fight goes. It's not about the number of enemy soldiers you kill. It's about winning the support of the locals there that will kind of stand by you and refuse to allow insurgents to take over that area. And we were doing that, making a lot of headway. And then flash forward months later, we were about 2 weeks before coming home, May 26, 2011, and we had just sort of gone out on what was for us a normal daily patrol. Sort of had found some unexploded ordnance that some local kids had reported to us. I think we basically safely disposed of those, and we were heading back to base. And just heading down the road, and out of nowhere, everything went silent. Felt like my body was sort of crushed, like an empty Coke can being hit by a freight train going 100 miles an hour. And but I didn't really have that much pain. I was just kind of confused as to what was going on. But I felt my body hit the ground. I noticed the dust sort of settling around me. And as I started to piece things together, I said, okay, this is what's happening. My body feels a little numb, dust. I guess I must have just been hit by an I.E.D. But, from what I recall, I was thinking clearly, so I figured it couldn't be that bad. But my legs felt a little bit numb. And so I kind of tried to sit up to assess the damage, expecting to see maybe a broken leg or something. And honestly, I can't put into words sort of the gut-wrenching, nauseating feeling that came over me to see that my legs were gone. They were not taken off in an operating room. They weren't beyond being able to save or something like that. They were vaporized. All I saw was a charred, bloody mess of bone and flesh sticking out. And I didn't know it at the time, but my right arm was almost completely severed at the elbow as well. And I didn't know what to do. I put my head back. I knew that we did not have a medic with us on patrol that day because he had been tasked out to a different assignment for that day. And So I put my head back and I did the only thing I thought I could do, and I called out for help. And I saw the boots of a couple of my soldiers sprinting up to me, and I blacked out. And I guess I wish I could say that I just stayed blacked out, but I didn't. I came to about a minute later. At that point, my soldiers had already put tourniquets on my arm, both of my legs, and then we started the waiting process. And my soldiers did everything. It was about 112 degrees out. They poured every ounce of water they had over me to keep me cool, slapped me in the face to keep me awake. Without a medic, had no morphine. I guess we learned our lesson from the Vietnam War that you give everybody morphine, people just use it when they don't need it, and then they don't have it when they need it. But we didn't have a medic who had it. So all that we could do, someone rolled up a T-shirt and I bit down on it and screamed. And it took, I think, about 35 minutes or so from the initial explosion to when the medevac helicopter eventually touched down. The first helicopter actually, as it was approaching, it was getting close. I heard over the radio that I had mechanical problems and had to turn back around. And that's when the pain really set in. But I got on the helicopter, and that's when I blacked out. Apparently flatlined for about four minutes on helicopter, but made it to a roll-through trauma bay in Kandahar airfield, and kind of chaperoned around for surgeries. And then I woke up 3 days later in Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio to see my brother's face standing over me.
How many days later?
About 3.
3 days later.
You were one of the 97%, barely. And that number's important, whether, Dave can quibble about how important it was academically or medically. It was psychologically really important to the people on the ground in Afghanistan and Iraq. I spent a lot of time with them, and, they used to say, if you basically survive that first hour, you're going to make it. You get wounded. And that mattered a lot for, these are big military words. They don't necessarily translate very easily into civilian life, but readiness, the willingness of a unit to go out and patrol was in some ways dependent on the sense that if something happened, that they could have a high survival rate, chance of a positive outcome. It affected morale. It affected the sense that the country was behind them. And it maybe in some ways made it possible for people like you, Greg, to call a patrol like that routine or ordinary, because those patrols weren't routine or ordinary in any other context whatsoever. But Dave, can you tell us something about what contributed to that survival rate? Was it equipment, training, surgical procedure? The medevac, like 35 minutes, and that's with 2 aircraft. That's really fast. The casualty evacuation management, what was it? How did we get, you said we were at 10% essential mortality early in the wars, and it went to 2 or 3%. How did we get there? What contributed?
Well, this is unplanned. This is a segue. Greg's allowed me to talk a little bit about some of the brutishness of this. I got his permission beforehand. But follow on what he said. So let's make up a case. I haven't written it. We'll just make up a case that's not quite his, so it doesn't touch too close to home. And that is, the answer is that the morale that the soldier and the Marine gets by believing in the 97% is true. It's actually, overall, I don't want to do that. It's 90, it was around 90%, now it may be as high as 98%, and again, that's that learning curve. But if you make it to a facility alive, you have a 98% chance of remaining alive. And the question that Chris just asked is, why is that? And the answer was given to us by Greg. Let's have a line of 5 vehicles. Second vehicle is an armored Humvee. You know what that is? It's a glorified Jeep. And it's got 4 guys in it, and they're going down the road to Fallujah from Baghdad, and it's the second one in the line of 5, and it gets blown to smithereens. The The insurgents let the first one go by. They want to stop the line of 5. The second one goes over the mine, and this mine is huge. He'll tell you what it is, a big shell, and it blows the thing up in the air, turns it up, spins it, and drops it on the ground. And the driver is a Lance Corporal in the Marines, and he has, in that explosion, not unlike Greg, he's lost his left leg at the knee, he's lost his left arm, and he's got perforating shrapnel injuries to his abdomen, to his chest, and to less so to the side of his head. And right after the smoke clears, unlike Greg's case, there are lots of medics around because it's a line of 5 vehicles. And the medics come down on this fellow, our Lance Corporal Snuffy, and they put 4 tourniquets on him. He's lost his left leg at the side of the vehicle, but they've tourniqueted his thigh, they've tourniqueted his arm, they've tourniqueted his other 2 extremities because those are also bleeding. They've placed bandages on his abdomen and chest, they've protected his airway, and they have covered him with hemostatic bandages for the bleeding wounds that you can see. And the tourniquet that we've mentioned a couple, 3 times this evening is not my belt. It's not a narrow little thing tied like you see on a cowboy show. It's a wide strap, as wide as the palm of my hand. So there's more pressure put on the limb. It's wrapped tightly about the extremity, and it has a windlass on it that you can crank. You are supposed to crank it, and how much are you supposed to crank it? You're supposed to crank it till you lose a pulse or stop the bleeding. The goal is to stop the circulation in that limb. And surprise, 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 this is a rediscovery. Tourniquets weren't used in the Vietnam War. They were disparaged. The idea of putting a tourniquet on a limb and cutting off the circulation was not a good idea. You were going to lose the limb. And so it wasn't done. And it wasn't done in Korea, and it was rarely done in World War II. Even though the idea of it is a couple hundred years old, it only until our recent wars going on now in Southwest Asia did it come back into fashion, and it is remarkably effective. It works, and it saves lives. How many lives? To the point of 90%. So back to our Corporal Snuffy. He's got 4 tourniquets on him. And he is quickly helicoptered back to the 212th MASH. And he's taken into the 212th MASH, mostly undressed, and placed on a table for care. Now we'll stop for a second. Just the day before that happened, our new batch of green senior captains and junior major doctors from Walter Reed Hospital have arrived in Iraq. They flew across the Atlantic. They have no idea, like I didn't, what they're about to see. They're green behind the ears. They have never seen the polytrauma that I spoke about earlier. They have an idea about it, they've heard about it, but they've never seen it, they've never treated it. And so Captain Lounsbury comes in, and he's handed this patient, our Marine corporal, to take care of him because the triage doctor, who's a surgeon, she's determined that he's most likely to survive. In other cases, there were 4 more brought into the hospital, and they are worse. And so she has said, you, Dr. Lounsbury, take care of this fellow and resuscitate him. And he comes up to the fellow, and like you've all seen on television, on our hospital serials, he shouts, I want 2 IVs, 2 large bore IVs, and I want you to run saline wide open, now. And so the crew at that day does just that. Now, I need to tell you, Lance Corporal Snuffy had this devastating injury, a lot of blood loss, but he's awake. He keeps asking about his left hand and whether he lost it or not, and the nurse won't tell him. He keeps telling them not to tell his wife. He doesn't want his wife to know because she's just had a baby, and he just wants to tell her later. And he's awake and alert, and he's not bleeding. Those tourniquets that were put on all 4 of his extremities are working. They've stopped the bleeding. And Dr. Lounsbury has ordered this wide open saline to bring up his blood pressure, which is only 80/40 and thready. He's hypotensive. It's only going to get worse. Let's refill the tank. And he orders that wide open saline in 2 lines into his arms. And 90 seconds, that's a real number, a minute and a half later, the nurse says to Dr. Lounsbury, he's oozing from his limbs. Dr. Lounsbury, looks like he's bleeding. And so Dr. Lounsbury says, tighten up those tourniquets and get me a celiotomy pack, because he thinks that some of those perforating wounds in his abdomen may be hemorrhaging, which has caused the hypotension, and he's going to open up the belly. He's thinking about it. He really is not sure how to prioritize what he's looking at. Should he take care of the stump? Should he take care of the arm? What should he do next? But he's thinking there's hemorrhage in the abdomen, and that's not a bad idea. So he's getting this pack that's used as a surgical kit for the abdomen, and the saline is running in. And at night, he came in talking and awake and not bleeding, and now he's oozing from his stump. A lot of oozing. And at 2 minutes out, another 30 seconds, some of the perforations of his chest and abdomen are beginning to bleed. They weren't bleeding when he came in, but they're bleeding now. And a wound on the side of his head near his ear is now running frank blood, and it wasn't when he arrived. And the abdomen, when this skinny guy arrived, is now protuberant. It was flat, but now it's swollen, and it wasn't beforehand. And at 3 minutes, he arrests, and they begin CPR. And at 4 minutes, he's died. And the triage surgeon, a senior surgeon, she's a colonel, she comes in and looks at this, because this was the patient who was supposed to survive. And she says, what the fuck just happened? And there's an answer to that in survival. And that is that when Corporal Snuffy was out there on the desert, he hemorrhaged enormously. He lost half his blood volume. But what he bled was blood. And what he got back in the mash was water. Now, it helps a little bit for me to explain this, for you to think of it like soup, and then I'll finish. You've got a pot of pea soup on the stove, and my wife comes in and she says, I'm sorry, but 4 more are coming tonight. We need to stretch that. So I go up to the pot of pea soup and I pour in a quart of water. And what happens? It dilutes the soup. It dilutes it. Well, that's what Dr. Lounsbury inadvertently did to our patient. The patient bled blood, but Dr. Lounsbury ordered water, which was the standard of care in Vietnam and in Korea and previously. It was not, that's not a black and white comment that I made, but the resuscitation of shock is still routinely done with saline or another fluid called Ringer's lactate. So the soup is the blood, and what blood is not, it's a solution, as you all know, you've all bled, and it's full of white blood cells, red blood cells, platelets, and these gooey big molecules called proteins that make clots. And if these 2 wide open IVs are pouring saline into our poor corporal, they're diluting that blood, those coagulation factors and those few platelets left, the way I diluted the soup on the stove. And so what I should have done, what Dr. Lounsbury should have done and did not do, is he should have transfused blood, whole blood, fresh whole blood, and it's available. One thing you have to say about the Army Medical Corps, they have perfected the walking blood bank. And knowing that a mass cal is on the way, they can mobilize it and they can have warm, fresh, whole blood available faster than you think. But it turns out, and now I'll finish, that in this particular case, had I done that, had I ordered the whole blood, there wouldn't have been any. And the reason there wouldn't have been any, I've already told you. There were 4 or 5 other casualties much worse off, and the senior triage surgeon gave me this casualty because he could wait a little bit. And I did the wrong thing. But if I had thought and done the right thing, which is now a practice guideline, even though they were out of fresh whole blood, I could still give them a composite that's not the same thing, but close. It's a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio of packed red blood cells, fresh frozen plasma, and it's not saying, it's plasma, packed red cells, and platelets. Believe it or not, platelets are available in the theater. Those three, 1-to-1-to-1. Platelets are a rather new addition, and if you didn't have platelets, you could just give the packed red cells, plasma, and stop there. But what you would not use is water today, and that's a major change in the management.
That's how we got to 2% or 3%.
Correct.
Dave, I'm going to thank you for your
major
answer
change
for another
in the
reason
theater.
too, Dave. Before we met, we said that these Times talks are different than almost all the other Times talks that the newspaper sponsors, because we've never gotten through one, and we've done about 8 without the word fuck. And Dave said he wouldn't be the one.
No, I retired and I wanted to quit swearing after. It's a resolution.
No, I think Lauren will be pleased. The streak lives. We're talking a lot about survival rates, and I'm of the camp that the high survival rates, as much as they meant for morale, and for that word I used, readiness, as much as they meant for that, it's too easy to view them entirely as a positive, and it's created in the discourse, and many of you probably have heard these types of stories or seen the types of coverage where for the last 20 years we keep showing veterans who've come home and they have shiny new prosthesis, or they've now taken up scuba diving. They've had these wonderful outcomes. And so we talk about what happens in the first hour or days or weeks as if, the arc of life has been preserved and it can continue. And we have a drawback with that, in my view, that they set up this common brand, this idea in the discourse that things turn out better than they might. These wounds last a lifetime. You don't have to survive the first hour. You have to get on with the entirety of your life and all that goes into that. And there's a lot of issues that follow, and there's many forms of suffering that take new forms that you don't imagine, in the combat hospital or in the helicopter as you're being evacuated. Greg, I'd like to come back to you, and let's talk about some of the medical issues you face as an amputee that the glossy coverage misses.
Sure. I would just start by saying that I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, because I think that seeing that out there is good for soldiers that do find themselves in that situation to be given hope that there is and there is a potential for life once you get through, get out of the tunnel. And I'll say that for me, and I think a lot of people I spoke to agreed that when we deployed and we raised our hand and said, we'll serve our country, we're kind of okay with two outcomes. Either we're going to go and maybe get dinged up a little bit, but we're going to come home and be fine and have some more stories to tell, or we were going to go and we were going to give our lives. And I think most of us were pretty much okay with both of those. What a lot of us, and myself for one, really never gave much thought about was, what about this sort of middle ground where you don't die, but you also don't come back the whole self that you were when you left. And I can tell you that when I woke up in the hospital, there was sort of this initial elation and sort of very positive feelings coursing through me. I had thought that I was going to be dead on this dirt road out in the middle of nowhere, Afghanistan, never get a chance to say goodbye to my mom or my siblings or anything like that. And yet, here I was. And so those initial, couple hours and days were very positive. When that faded, I will tell you that that's when the real nightmare really began. And it's a mix of physical and psychological basically horrors that I endured, and I can't speak for everybody, but I'm willing to bet that many other veterans had similar experiences and overlap with me. But from the physical standpoint, just when I woke up at the hospital, that's when everything starts getting better from here. You survived. It's a long, long road to recovery. It's a lot of setbacks. It was probably maybe a whole week or two before the holes in my legs were actually fully closed up with skin grafts. Initially, they were just covered with wound vacs, sort of sucking out material and helping to draw fluids away from the deeper part of the limbs. What would happen in the years that would follow from after I woke up? I've had over 50 surgical procedures, not just on the legs and the arm, but both eardrums were totally blown out. Needed to have surgery on the ears. Numerous infections. Actually, my arm, although it was severed quite poorly or badly from the initial blast, it was actually the worst damage came from an infection that ate away almost all the bone in my arm about 3 months after the initial injury. And they had to cut out 9 inches of segment of bone from shortly a little bit below my shoulder all the way down to my wrist. And they told me basically, if you were anybody else, we would have amputated the arm. But because you're already missing a couple limbs, we'll give you the option of trying to save it, which took about almost 2 years of wearing an external frame from my shoulder all the way down to my wrist, working with a limb salvage expert to regrow and stretch the remaining bone that was there. Remarkably, we were able to regrow 8.5 inches of bone. Weren't able to regrow the elbow, but they fused it, and I can't bend my arm, but at least I have it there and have my hand. So setback after setback, unrelenting pain, phantom pain. I can tell you it's real. To this very day, I still have sleepless nights a few times a month, sometimes more frequently, and it changes, but often for me, the best way I can describe it is that someone's taking a sledgehammer to my shins or basically filleting the skin off my feet with a sharp knife, and there's nothing I can do about it because there's nothing to massage, there's nothing to put ice on, and we don't really have any good pain meds that help. It's just sort of trial and error. Speaking of the medications, there was a point where I was on over 50 pills a day, from everything from sleep aids to pain meds, antidepressants, you name it. Getting new meds to help with the side effects of the other meds. It was just sort of this medication landslide, I think people refer to it as. Eventually I was on max doses of a lot of these medications and they weren't working, and if I tried to come off of them, I would go through drug withdrawal, and so I felt kind of trapped. I had to be on these medications to prevent being withdrawal, but they weren't doing much for me. And I kind of felt like I was just sort of a zombie, just sort of in and out of consciousness throughout the day. Didn't like the way I felt, which sort of led to this sort of psychological torture of I was never the most religious person, but whatever faith I had, I went through periods where I completely lost my faith. And if there was ever a time in my life where I needed a higher power to reach out to know that someone was watching out for me, I had lost it. And it's not a light switch you can turn on and off. And to feel extremely abandoned in those moments, it sucked. To have a lost sense of self, before, within a matter of seconds, I'd gone from being this physically fit 25-year-old infantry captain that was powerful, dangerous, sexy, whatever you want to call it. I was kind of the king of my own world, and in a flash, I could barely sit up in bed. I needed people to help feed me, shave me, do whatever, and there's this big question mark over my head of, is this ever going to get better? Is life actually worth living? Had a lot of sleepless nights, a lot of tears that I cried, and spiraled into a deep depression. And then as the years gone on, after I got off the medications, the surgeries became less frequent, I became more independent. One thing that still goes on to this very day is that I struggle with is feeling like you're a public spectacle. You roll down the street in a wheelchair, missing your legs. I get it, people don't see it every day, but I can't go through the grocery store without having people stare and hear the whispers and, hey, mommy, look at that guy without his legs, and blah, 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 blah. It kind of sucks to feel like you're a fucking freak show out in public. All that stuff comes together, and so the shiny prosthetics and everything, I can say that most of the guys like myself we're just doing the best we can with what we've got, but it doesn't mean that it's all been peaches and cream.
Alexis, we look at Greg, as he just said. People look at and wonder if you said fucking freak show. And, you can see his body's a registry of these war traumas. It's very obvious when you see Greg or people in Greg's cohort what you're looking at. if you're paying half attention anyhow. But you talked earlier about invisible wounds, which Greg also has just described. And you talked about, you know, invisible wounds and how they can be just as impairing for many veterans as some of the more visible wounds. I'll bet there's people in this room who have them. That's how invisible they are. Moral injury, traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, sustained exhaustion and depression that goes with hypervigilance or can accompany hypervigilance. Can you talk about this? We didn't give you enough time. This is really your specialty. I'd like to turn the mic over to you to talk about the wounds that we don't see, but that are, I'm sure they're around us in this room. They're around you a lot of times in your daily life, and you don't even realize there's a veteran near you who's carrying it.
Yeah, so I think that we are seeing that 97% maybe that we're talking about here who's coming back. For a lot of them, they're looking really good when they come back, and they come home and they get back with their families, and over time they're realizing, but I'm not quite who I was before all of this. And it's, for a lot of military servicemen and veterans that we meet, it feels vague. It feels like they almost have a hard time describing it on occasion. I have trouble with my memory. I have trouble paying attention. I can't seem to re-engage in work. I don't really want to be around other people. I used to be really social, and now I don't really want to be. I don't find that the things that seem important to my family or civilians are terribly important to me. I'm struggling to connect with my kids, my spouse, my parents, and it becomes something that not only affects them, but then also can affect their family members, right? So, we say at home base that the family members are still, pardon me. I'm going to stop right there. I can't remember the word. But the family members don't necessarily sign up for this, right? And so, but they're very much impacted by it. And so that's a lot of what we're seeing when folks come home. So they're surviving, they have their limbs, they're walking around the street, but they're not functioning. They're not functioning the way that they thought they would when they came back. And they're not really sure where to go with that. There's services through the VA, there's a variety of groups, and I think you said you can take a trip to Disneyland with the Wounded Warrior Project. But they still are not feeling back like themselves. And so, and one of the things that we most commonly deal with is repetitive head trauma. So, for example, you are the guy in the third or the fourth vehicle that you spoke about. And so you've been now within somewhere 10, 20 meters of a single blast. And you survive, right? And you come back to camp, and then you go back out. And then maybe there's more blast exposure, but again, you're not physically wounded. So you continue, and so you have a long deployment, 18 months, something like that. You come home for a couple months, you go back out for another deployment, and you have similar blast exposure. You come home for training, and you do some hand-to-hand combat, and you get knocked out a couple of times. And then on top of all that, you maybe drank a little bit too much as a coping strategy while you were home, and you got in a motor vehicle accident, you whacked your head. And then also you got in a bar fight and you got knocked out, but we didn't really talk too much. We didn't want to bring that up to anybody, right? And all of a sudden you have these compounded head injuries, right? Some of them are blast related, some of them are blunt force, Some of them are occurring in theater. A lot of them are occurring at home. If you look at the data, a lot of these injuries are occurring in training and at home. And we have folks who are coming back, and as they're trying to reassimilate, they find they have cognitive impairments, they have headaches, they have emotional difficulties. They're keeping them from functioning. And it's these sort of quieter, more insidious type of injuries that are impacting a large number of folks. So we tend to try to help people identify what it is that's going on for them, how brain trauma, repetitive head injury, plus the traumatic experiences that they've had psychologically together can actually really be functionally impairing, and talk about sort of treatment strategies for these things. I would say, just to echo on your comment maybe when you started, that we're not finding that people are totally broken, right? What we're really actually finding is that people are just doing the best they can with what they've got. And they're trying to navigate the world that they're in now with the mind that they have now. But we're seeing that through evidence-based treatment strategies, getting people into care, helping to break down the stigma of mental health, helping to break down the stigmas surrounding concussions, mild brain injuries, that we're getting more people into care. We're getting them the care that they need. So sometimes, evidence-based treatment isn't always available. And we're trying to get people to function better with what they've got, right? So we're not arguing for that we can take away what people have experienced or been exposed to when they've been deployed or in their training. But we can help them to function better and sort of live better lives afterwards. So, I sometimes feel, particularly with these sort of gentlemen who've been deployed, that I don't really, as a civilian, that I'm not sure I have a lot of power to say this, but in the work that we do with so many service members and their families, we do see people who are getting better. There's a lot of, I think, hope, because we see them fighting to get back what they feel like they've lost. And a lot of people are learning to function with the difficulties that they have, not necessarily always feeling whole again, but feeling like they can be who they wanted to be for their family, and in a more civilian society.
That's a good chance to go back to Greg on the subject of getting better. We've mostly been talking about medical issues so far, right? Talking about how you treat someone or how someone recovers medically. But there are a lot of factors that are not medical at all that influence the experience of life after being wounded, including recovery. Some are obstacles, and some can lead to recovery that are not medical therapies whatsoever. Could you talk a little bit, Greg, about some of the things you've done to help recover?
Well, just real quick, one thing that's on the challenges front, I don't think it's necessarily unique to injured veterans, but perhaps just something my eyes were opened to, going from, prior to my injury, the worst injury I ever had was a sprained ankle, to suddenly being this poly-trauma war vet and learning to navigate the world. And one of the unforeseen challenges that I don't think people ever gets really much attention is increased cost of living. Think about here, it's already expensive real estate here in Boston, but imagine if any of the walk-ups or townhouses, anything that's got stairs, not an option. And then you need a building with an elevator that you can get up. And a lot of the apartments you go up into, for whatever reason, the bathroom is about this big. And so I'll be damned if I'm going to live in an apartment and have to sort of crawl to a toilet. So you want to find a place that's got an elevator, got access, has a wide bathroom, wide doors. The options are now, very few and far between, and those places tend to be more modern, much more expensive places. Truth be told, I pay about double for my rent these days than I used to prior to being injured. Add to that simple household repairs and things like that I might be able to do on my own. I don't need to hire a contractor. Public transportation, you want to take subways and things like that. Not the most user-friendly for folks in a wheelchair, so you gotta maybe dish out for an Uber or drive yourself. Other things that change besides increased cost of living, change in family dynamics. My wife has to take on more roles than she used to, or might have had to, had I been able to be sort of the husband that I ideally would like to be. I used to be sort of the brawn, and she was the brains, and now she's the brains and the brawn, and I'm just sort of a passenger in the whole ride. I've seen at military hospitals kids, sort of being disrupted in, traditional family, sort of roles. I've seen while the mother or father veteran is recovering and the spouse is trying to help coach them personally through it. I've seen kids having to take on roles like cooking dinner for the family, 11-year-old kids really having to step up their game. All these things people don't appreciate. They look at the veteran, they see the injuries, and they can kind of imagine, wow, they went through some pain, and maybe they got some PTSD, and maybe some screws loose up here, whatever, but there's all these other things that are circulating around that have very real impacts on you as a person and your recovery and your outlook on life that definitely change. Those are challenges as far as therapies and non-sort of surgical, medical things, sort of intangible stuff that, to me, I feel was essential in my recovery, were things like having love, support, compassion, and patience from the people around me. These recoveries take years and years, and there's a lot of times setbacks, one step forward, 2 steps back sort of thing. And I wasn't always the most pleasant person as I was sort of adjusting to my new life circumstances. But thanks be to God that I had the faith has sort of come back. That I had a loving, caring family that didn't give up on me, that didn't kick me to the curb and said, hey, you're an asshole. I don't know, we're trying to help, man, but screw you. I had people that stood by me and let me, work things out, and luckily was there when I was ready. And so having patience, love, compassion, having hope. I mentioned, seeing these shiny prosthetics and people doing things. One of my motivations for going to med school is that I want to be sort of an example of. To me, I feel like I'm sort of an ideal sort of circumstance of what is possible when you can connect all the stars, the best of modern medicine, the best of a supporting, caring, loving network, and amazing nonprofit foundations that have filled in a lot of the gaps. And I want to show that to my patients. And I also not just want to show my patients, but I want to show the other medical professionals that I work alongside. I want them to see what is possible, and I don't want them just to sort of settle for, we pieced you together, we put tourniquets on you, and we saved your life, go on. No, I want them to strive for not just living. I want people to get out there and strive and thrive in their lives. And so I want to be able to sort of push that bar and give hope to people. And then one last thing that I'll just mention that one thing that I was a part of that I saw was really amazing is the power of music. There's a nonprofit down based sort of out of Walter Reed called MusiCorps, and its whole idea is basically getting veterans that have, like myself, that have gone through really traumatic injuries and maybe have reached sort of a plateau in their recovery where they're not really seeing much progress. Maybe they don't want to go to occupational therapy or physical therapy anymore because they're not seeing the progress that they maybe saw in earlier parts of the recovery. And that's a bad place to be. Guys find themselves in their barracks rooms sort of sitting, dwelling on life and sort of contemplating sort of existential thoughts, and that can go down sort of dark paths. Meanwhile, right there at Walter Reed, there's this program that gets guys out of their room and says, whatever instrument you want to learn, whether it's some Native American flute or the drums or trumpet, guitar, whatever it may be, they will teach you and they will get you professional musicians and partner with you, and they'll do whatever they need to do to make adaptive equipment. Because at the end of the day, when we started making music, if you put a curtain behind us, people just hear great music. There's nothing disabled about it. You take people who have, like I said, maybe more depressed, weren't communicating a lot. And even if we're not verbally speaking with one another, people are communicating. You have to communicate to play music with other people. And I've seen people completely get turned around, and the power of music just sort of transcend any emotions you're having as an outlet, as a hobby, and to be able to finally see some progress that people are making they may not have seen in their physical recovery, but suddenly they're going from not knowing how to play an instrument to becoming talented and playing songs, and it has a really powerful thing. So there's a lot of stuff out there that's not just great medicine and surgery and talented physicians. That's essential to successful recovery.
Thank you. So we're going to do 2 more questions, then we'll do Q&A with you. We're running a little late because we started a little late, but on total time, we're still on track. If there were a label on me like a pack of cigarettes, it would tell most of you that I'm probably the most negative person you're going to meet today. So I got to get some negatives in. I got 2 questions left. So Dave, we've talked for years on the phone about medical and other military issues, and I want to reprise some of our riffs over time. There's a risk when you start talking about 98% survival rates that we're sort of repeating the DoD's self-congratulatory messaging about advances in life-saving, and we're looking over a lot of things that were not nearly so bright. When I was in Afghanistan and Iraq, I routinely saw this modern military force, ours, deny care to non-Western patients and to take Afghans who were alongside American troops away from this high standard of care and leave them to local facilities with little resources where these survival rates plummeted. One was called Camp Hero. Everyone I knew, and I flew in the medevac helicopters quite a bit, called it Camp, not Hero, but Camp Zero, because they said that was your chance of living if you got left there. And that's where they took all the Afghans. We also saw a cover-up and denial of certain battlefield risks, like those posed by remnant chemical weapons, burn pit exposures, and active discussions and lingering concerns about malaria prophylaxis that was forced on troops, and then as well as into reintegration back home with patients with the less visible wounds that the military missed, often because it wasn't surveilling its population very well. And then, Dave, there's your book, this, War Surgery in Afghanistan and Iraq, which I understand they're selling my book outside. They really ought to sell this one. It's much better. It's an essential book that shows the typical traumas of the wars. It shows them in graphic terms, so graphic, so useful that the Army tried to censor it and block its publication. Dave, I'd like you to tell us about that, your fight to get this book released to the public. And it leads to the really dark question, which is, is military medicine even an oxymoron? I mean, to what extent you're a doctor, can that be challenged, being a doctor for a national military force where in some cases you may be told not to treat patients who aren't from your nation?
That's a whole other 2 or 3 hours. It's not all good. It's not all good. If I had a career in the Army Medical Department. They paid my way through medical school, and I owed them time back. And when my time was up, they said, you can leave. And I was in the middle of Europe at Lounsbury Army Medical Center, and I didn't want to go home. And so I stayed on year by year. And every time I started, I never, ever, never, hand on heart, God is listening, I never intended to make a career out of it. But each time I said, that's it, now I'm going to be a real doc. An opportunity came my way to teach at Walter Reed or in San Francisco, blah, 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 and I didn't want to turn it down. But it's not all good. The bad news is that wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have lasted, as Chris said earlier, it's almost 20 years now. Do you realize that? It's almost 20 years. That's terrible. That's terrible. You can agree or disagree. I think it's terrible. But out of that terribleness spun a positive. And the positive is that we were able to make this 98%. They didn't learn like that you weren't supposed to give 2 wide-bore IVs full of saline, that you should use these ratios I just told you. And there are 100 examples of what I just said, and it's all published and printed in guidelines. But it took 20 years, so you decide whether it was worth it. But the first stage of that 20 years is that when I served with the invasion force. They number these now. I don't even know what we're up to. Mine was OIF 1, Operation Iraqi Freedom 1, which was 2003, when we invaded the country with shock and awe. And there were none of those guidelines. And so when I returned to Walter Reed at the end of 2003, the Surgeon General wanted us to do something about that. And I got to be careful with the pronoun, but I know I have to shorten this. San Antonio, Texas, which is Army Medical Command, had begun a process of putting out a book to tell these young green senior captains and junior majors on that plane to Iraq what they were going to see and how to take care of it, so they weren't as stupid and awkward and unprepared as the first groups that went over. Remember the learning curve. And so when I got back, there was a big, huge cardboard box on my desk at Walter Reed, and to make 9 months, to make a long story short, I went through this box of work that had started in Texas and started at the head and went to the eyes and the neck and the chest and the abdomen and the limbs and blood transfusion, and it was green. It was called the Emergency War Surgery Manual, 3rd United States edition, and it was put out in 2004. And what I did was I slipped into the back of the book a 3x5 card, and we dispatched 15,000 copies to every single solitary doctor, surgeon or physician, medic and corpsman, to take with him and her to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And what I asked them to do was say, tell me how I did. Is it a good book? Is it a bad book? What's wrong about it? What's right about it? Send back your stuff. Give me some input, and we'll put out a new edition and we'll fix it. And to my delight and surprise, I'd say 30, not very many, but 30, not more than 40, not less than 30, information came back. And that's that book. People wrote me letters. One of them wrote it on a brown paper bag. I got emails, I got photographs, and they sent back cases of how to amputate a limb and how to treat a neck wound and whether you open the abdomen first or the chest first. It's all in the book. And I collected them into 85 cases, which are in the War Surgery Atlas, and finished it on New Year's Eve, 2007. And it was supposed to be published immediately, and it wasn't. And a week would go by, and a month would go by. Again, I am shortening this. I got called to the censor's office at the Pentagon, and I want badly to be a hero like this guy, to have that macho courage he was talking about a minute ago. But I wasn't. I was drenched with sweat, absolutely terrified. We're trying to keep this clean. I told you my retirement resolution, but every other word was the F word when I got inside the censor's office of yours and my Pentagon. And they turned to me, and Chris is wrong. He made one mistake tonight. He said they tried to censor it. No, they didn't. They did censor it. It was censored. Wasn't going to get published. Done. All over with. Take your book. Have a nice day. Every other word was the F word. What the F do you think you're effing doing, Colonel Lounsbury, publishing these effing pitches? And it was pitches, P-I-T-C-H-A-S. I don't think anybody's read it. I don't believe anybody's read the book. But the censors had looked at the pitches.
The book is circulating, by the way. You can all look at the pictures.
They looked at the
around
images. And when I was, now I'm really old, when I was a kid, I am 69 years old. And when I was a teenager, some of you will match my age, I hope, the Vietnam War spilled into our living room every night on black and white television, NBC's Huntley Brinkley and CBS's Cronkite. and you saw piles of dead Americans and wounded Americans and Americans with limbs blown off. It was in Life magazine. Behind a moment ago, Chris and I were talking about an iconic photograph of wounded Americans on a half-track in Vietnam. And we saw the battle at Hue. Remember all that? We saw all this. Everybody saw it and knew this war was going on. And on Fridays, in the right upper corner of the TV screen, they'd tell you how many Americans were dead, how many were wounded, and how many Vietnamese were dead. And it was always 100 or 200 Americans dead, 5.2 times that wounded, and there were zillions of Vietnamese supposedly dead. And that's how we metered the war. But, and I'm steering clear of politics, I swear, but the administration of Bush and Cheney took a message from that. And they said they understood that the protests against the Vietnam War in a draft age society were what put the kibosh on lengthening that war and the invasion of Cambodia. I won't go through the history of the Vietnam War, but there was a homegrown protest that was monumental. People were shot dead on American campuses for protesting the war in Vietnam. Unless you know something that I don't know, you can hear a pin drop for all the protests of this 20-year-old war that we've just talked about tonight. Nobody's protesting in the street. We could talk about why. I'm not going there. But the point was, the book is full of pitches of trauma. And they came, I was terrified. And I turned to the head censor. I was going to tell you his name, I won't. And I said, it's a book about trauma. What did you think was going to be in the book? We didn't do it in secret. We didn't do it in a basement somewhere. I worked on it for 2 calendar years to put that book together. I was going to tell you about that. I won't even tell you about that. But it took a long time, took 2 calendar years, a lot of work, 7 days a week to put together this book, and it was banned. You may not publish. They had the galleys in front, if you know, they had these large galleys. And I'll stop. I was saved. I'm not religious, but I was saved at the 11th hour because 2 people, ABC Nightly News, which used to be anchored by Bob Woodruff, who had a serious brain injury. Mr. Woodruff, Bob, was at Walter Reed as a patient when I was there, and I approached him and his wife Lee and asked if he was absolutely pro-Army medicine and what they had done for him, and asked him if he would like to write the foreword to the book, and he said he did. He would like to. Lee and I did most of it. He did. We have that. So but he's owned by ABC Nightly News, and ABC said, we need to see this thing that you're using this fellow's name. And I sent them the galleys. And the Christmas, I told you I finished the book at New Year's of 7. That Christmas, I went to a party not very far from here, which with a hand in your pocket, the other one holding a glass of white wine. And this lady came up to me from the New York Times and said, what do you do? And I said, what do you do? Her name was Sarah Reimer. And I told her, and she said, I think that would be interesting for the New York Times. If those of you who get the Times, Tuesdays get Science and Health section. And she said, I think that would go well in the New York Times. And so I sent her the galleys. So now they've banned the book. And I went to the Army Surgeon General, General Schoomaker, and I've heard later and seen on the web that Dr. Lounsbury threatened him. I couldn't threaten a mouse. But what I did do is I knew Eric Schoomaker as a peer, as a colonel doctor to a colonel. He's now a Surgeon General. And I told him the truth. I said, you know, they banned the book. And it's not going to get published. And he'd also seen the galleys. I wrote his foreword that says, his preface that he gets to sign on. You have to do that in the service. And I told him what had happened, and I said, you know, if you don't publish the book, I think ABC Nightly News and the New York Times are going to find that newsworthy. And he agreed. And he ordered the book published. And so even though it had been banned, I don't know, I actually saw the first part of the email train where he told this person to publish the book. I have it, I saved it. But that's why the book came out. The point of this prattle is that yours and my government, I'm sticking with my junior majors and senior captains. Here's a trauma book to be married with the emergency war. There's no pitches in here, but there's bullets on how to take off a leg. There's a way to do it and a way not to do it. There's a way to transfuse that I told you and a way not to do it. And it's in here. And what that book does is it's married to the war surgery manual so you can see that trauma before you go over there. It was only meant to help save lives. And yours and my government banned it because they didn't want you to see the pitches. And I don't have the end of that. I keep saying I'm going to stop, and I don't. I don't have the end argument. I hand out to you. There's an argument about that. Seriously. I've actually had trouble with it because I went one way or the other. Some people say, the censor's office at yours and my Pentagon says, you have no right, civilian, to look at these pitches because you're not a medical doctor. You're not a military medical doctor, and you have no idea what you're looking at. You don't understand warfare. You don't know if the loss of that casualty was worth it or not. You can't decide that, so you shouldn't see the pitches. Another school says, you're a taxpayer. You're paying for the damn war. It's gone on 20 years, and you're paying for it. There's been no pressure on the American public. You know, Mr. Bush told us to go shopping. But you're the taxpayer. And so other people say you have every right to see the pitches. If you want to see them, look at them. If you don't, don't. I took the latter. I thought not only could you see them, I said you should see them. You have to see them. It's your duty to see them. And Ellen Fitzpatrick, who used to be an American historian at Harvard, she's now a chair professor at UNH. If any of you know her, tell her I said her name. Ellen Fitzpatrick said, Lounsbury, you have no more right to tell them that they should, she hated the word should, than the censor has to say that they can't. And I've left it at that. All I'll tell you is that if you Google the title of the book, there is a very sanitized version of the controversy that I've just told you. That book was very controversial, and because of the controversy, and New York Times, thank you very much, it got a wider press. It was only intended for peer surgeons. You would never know anything about it, but because it had this story behind it, and it was written up in the Times and The Economist magazine and blah, 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 blah. The educated lay public, such as you, many of them said, I want to see this book. And it crossed over from the medical, technical sphere to the civilian sphere.
So Dave,
sorry, I didn't mean to.
We've argued amiably for years, and I'm going to go against your wishes right now and talk a little bit about where I think the origins of some of your passion comes from.
I have no passion about this.
Dave wouldn't want me to tell you this, but it's essential to do the full disclosure. His brother was a lance corporal in the Marines in Vietnam and stepped on a mine, lost both his legs and one of his arms when Dave was a teenager. And maybe the arc of your life and this passion has its roots in that trauma.
I don't think so. Everybody said, every doctor, no doctor born and lived has ever not been asked, why did you want to become a doctor? And people have concluded that because of my brother Guy, he was in Philadelphia Naval Hospital for 2.5 years. He lost both of his legs, such as Greg did. And he lost his right forearm, but I'm a doctor, I don't know what they did, but they used some Teflon cords, and they put his arm against his abdomen for 6 months, took it off for 6 months, put it on for 6 months, and at the end, he got a lobster claw. That's what we called it. And he could pick up things with it. And he could drive the hand controls on an automobile. His wheelchair was the seat in an automobile. But
I didn't say that's why you became a doctor.
I wasn't. I
think it might inform your passion when you were banging antlers against the censor. Now we'll go back to something more upbeat. You came here, remember I said, because you gave a shit, and you're probably wondering if there's anything you might do. So let's go local again, Alexis.
Yeah, let's do it.
If we wanted to channel some of the energy in the room in a way that would be productive for people who were wounded in the wars, how might we do that?
A big question. Here's what I'll say, and I'll try to be brief. Because clearly I was having word-finding difficulties on the last round of discussion, so it's probably past my bedtime. There are good evidence-based treatments for, at least I'm going to speak to what I know the invisible wounds of war. There are good programs out there that help people get better. It's not perfect. Doesn't maybe look like what it used to look like, but people are reaching out to get care. They are engaging in care, and there are a lot of groups, including ours at MGH and at Home Base, who are trying to break down all the barriers that might keep them from deciding to get care or being able to get care. What are some of those barriers? I don't recognize that I have a problem. Where there's a lot of educational, and we had a telethon last week and all sorts of things to try to help people understand that there may be something going on. I don't know necessarily where to go. Maybe I've been to one doctor, whether it's a civilian doctor through the Veterans Administration. It didn't go so well. I didn't connect with them, and so I think medical care is not for me. And that's probably not true. So that there's somewhere they can go, and that there are, people who are dedicated to trying to help, right? And that's basically our mission at Home Base. So we are completely free care for any active duty service member, veteran. We have a lot of roots in the post 9/11 era, but for any era of a service member. We are through Mass General, so we're part of that academic medical center. We have really good connections with the VA here in Boston to help people get care through us, and then also use the care that the government is providing for them. We're finding that over the last 10 years, which is how long we've been doing this, that we are helping people. And that we know that because people come back and they tell us that they're feeling better, and we see them out in the community, right? We see them go do things where they maybe previously weren't leaving their homes. We see people go back to school. We see people go back to work where they previously felt like they couldn't do those things. Again, is it perfect? Does it look the way they thought it might look? Maybe not. But they're functioning better. And we're using evidence-based treatment. We're using multidisciplinary care, and that can be medical stuff. And I'm an allopathic doctor. That's code for a pill pusher, so I'm very sorry about that. But we have a lot of other folks in our program who are doing a lot of different things, right? Manual therapies, resiliency, cognitive rehabilitation, meditation, yoga, exercise, health and wellness, nutrition, right? Coming at it from a variety of places to try to help enhance people's quality of life. And then there's some medicine in there too, for us folks. So there is a lot of ways to come at this for people who are continuing, who survived, who maybe look okay on the outside, but are not doing well on the inside. And Massachusetts has done a lot, the governor and other folks, to help try to support these sort of programs, because we absolutely believe that veterans here in Massachusetts deserve these things. So I'll leave it at that.
So this is where we turn it over to you. There's a microphone that will be passed around. If any of you have a question and would like to ask it of anyone on the panel, feel free to direct it directly to the person who you think the question is, or you can throw it up to the whole stage and we'll sort out who's best suited to reply.
Greg, I'm going to direct this to you. You didn't have a medic, and I'm just curious if you have any sense if, like, combat lifesaver training that your soldiers received got you through that 35-minute wait for medevac. And just going back to CJ's question about advancing, how we push down medical care in the Army.
Yeah, great question. Absolutely. I mean, my soldiers were just a mix of infantrymen and some armor tanker soldiers mixed in. We only had one medic for our platoon, and like I said, he wasn't there, but we were all trained with basic combat lifesaver training. We learned CPR, and in my case, and as Dave touched on, tourniquets. I mean, it's such a simple thing, but that was the difference between life and death for me. In fact, like I said, I only blacked out for a minute, and by the time I woke up, all three limbs were tourniqueted. That mixed with my squad leader knowing how to use a radio and calling a helicopter. But it wasn't, none of these guys were professionally trained. It was, and I know that that's sort of translated in to the civilian world here. There's some doctors. I do a lot of the clinical training over at Brigham and Women's Hospital. I know there's folks there and at MGH that are doing this Stop the Bleed campaign, which is kind of trying to bring that here to the States, and I think that the effectiveness of that was evidenced in the Boston Marathon bombings and people using makeshift tourniquets right here in our own home, in our own city, to stop the bleed. And it wasn't professional training; it's sort of basic combat lifesaver training that made all the difference. Absolutely.
Hi, this is for Dr. Lounsbury, sir. I worked under you at Moncrief Army Hospital.
Oh, it's nice to see you.
I just wanted to say that I have 20-something years altogether of medical between Air Force, Army, and civilian, and you were definitely the most influential doctor I ever worked with.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you.
The
What is your name?
rattlesnake.
What is your name?
At the time, I was Pacheco, Jackie Pacheco.
Yes.
We had the rattlesnake.
Yes.
on-
Yeah.
There was the guy from the basic trainee that had Guillain-Barré syndrome, and they put him in the psych ward for some odd reason.
Oh, that's a story. Yeah. Big mistake.
We
Thank you
figured
very
it
much.
out.
That's very kind of you.
Where can I find your book? Is it possible, or is it still suppressed?
Oh, I'm glad you said that. One of the many criticisms that came back to us online and the internet, such that JAG told me to get off of LinkedIn and Facebook, which I did, and I've never looked back. But one of the accusations was that we profited from it, that we made it. Nobody got a penny. I mean, I had my salary as an officer in the Army, but no contributor to that book got a dime. It was all pro bono, and you buy the book, and the money goes to the GPO, government printing office. The answer is I'm not good at this. It's Amazon sells the book, but because you and I were together at Moncrief, if you give me an address, I'll get you a book. Thank you for saying that. Was very nice of you.
First, I want to thank all of you for your service. I'm a prosthetist in the Boston area here, and my question for you, Dr. Lounsbury, is the unfortunate but good sides of war, as well as the Boston bombing that happened here, is for the first time in my career, we're seeing multiple advancements in amputation techniques, especially here in the Boston area. And if you ever think that we would see, once these amputation techniques are perfected, if they would then be brought onto the battlefield to help reduce the rate of revision surgeries after the fact?
Oh, that's a good question. My brother was blown up 50 years ago, and like Greg, his leg, one of his legs was blown off, and the other one they had to take. It was not salvageable. But in those days, it has evolved. I hope I'm answering. In those days, the technique for doing an amputation was called the guillotine technique. I'm not a surgeon, but they were chopped off in a guillotine measure. And the The anatomical landmarks they used to take it off were used for people, for example, with diabetes, where they went and had elective surgery and had a bad leg and it was taken off. It was done with a guillotine technique. What you know more about than I do as a prosthetist is that ruined the opportunity for folks like Greg and people in this war to have these these biomechanical, tendon salvage, nerve salvage, muscle salvage, any tendon, any nerve, any muscle, little bits and pieces that were taken off and thrown away in Vietnam. They say, if it's pink and bleeding and viable, they save it. And that's not a guillotine amputation, that's called a length sparing amputation, to save as much as you possibly can. I imagine Greg can take over. Save as much of the limb as possible. Don't guillotine it. Keep it and take it through multiple surgeries to salvage viable tissue so that you can take over with these modern carbon steel, carbon fiber prosthetics that gives the patient much more mobility and facility. Again, it's so variable. Guy, we called him Guy. Guy's amputations were very proximal. There was no stump, and he was given leg prosthetics, but he's standing up on these prosthetics, teetering at a center of gravity. You forget your center of gravity, which I guess is right here somewhere. And he would just topple over on these things. When he came home, we took him in his wheelchair and we threw him in the Wakefield, Massachusetts YMCA pool. And my father, I'm in the middle of 5, and the 3 brothers and my older brother, we tossed him in the pool. And he went down underwater. And when he came up, the part of his anatomy that came up was his bottom, his buttocks. And that was this center of gravity shift. And we were all thinking, oh my God, we've killed him. But my father said, well, get in there and turn him over. And we righted him, and he laughed all the way through. But I don't want to get off your question. Prosthetic management witnessed by the Boston bombing is just remarkable. That is a sea wind change in the way that we recover these patients. It's not guillotine, it's length sparing. You're right. My kudos to you.
I just wanted to offer my thanks to Home Base and offer testimony to all about how effective Home Base is. I worked for many years at Bunker Hill Community College, where there are many veterans. There was a young man who was a Marine who was injured by an I.E.D. who was in Walter Reed Hospital, and it was just about this time of year in the semester. He disappeared, and none of us could find him. And then on the first day of the semester in the spring, there he was walking down the hall. So I stopped him and said, what's going on? And brought him back to my office. And he burst into tears. This is a Marine, and said he'd take any help he could get, and that he had disappeared. He'd left because 2 more of his buddies had committed suicide. And I got a colleague, and we already had connections with Home Base. And we called Home Base, and I think within 2 hours of my finding him crying in the hallway, he was in Home Base's embrace, and they took good care of him. It's a serious situation, and we're not out of the woods yet, but they walk their talk at Home Base.
Oh, thank you.
Good evening, and I'll join the others in thanking all of you for coming this evening, as well as for your service. I actually have a handful of comments. I am a surgeon. Dr. Lounsbury, I first encountered your book as a civilian volunteer surgeon helping out at Launchstool on a couple of week rotation that some of us did with our vacation time. And I was introduced to it along with the other material and evidence-based guidelines that a green community vascular surgeon from the United States needed to face the music in that world. And I thank you very much for the excellent work. And that brings me to a couple of other comments, and I certainly don't object to CJ and the others reflecting on some of the limitations of the military medical system, and I certainly wouldn't comment it as being perfect. However, when I came back as a graduate of an Ivy League medical school and having worked in reputable hospitals in the surgical world, my comment to most of my colleagues was that in many ways our civilian medical world could learn a tremendous amount from where you spent your career, Dr. Lounsbury. The unified evidence-based work that produced the initial book that you referred to about war wound management, as well as the photographic guidelines in the second book. As I understand it, as a civilian outsider, a lot of it put together by the AISR, Army Institute of Surgical Research,
That's right.
which has cataloged a massive amount of data, allowed someone like myself with no experience managing patients like Greg to be at least reasonably successful in that world. And I must say that in our civilian medical world, we simply don't have that kind of unified evidence-based approach to things. Although I'm sure Dr. Iaccarino works very hard to do that, the problem is we're far too splintered, and every institution is trying to do this on its own with pressure to publish locally, et cetera, and we don't come close to what the military has achieved there. Likewise, with all the pressure that arose in the recent years to establish a functional, interactive medical record in civilian medicine, it's a total failure. I can't communicate from my office with the hospital a quarter mile away, whereas when I was at Landstuhl, I had all the medical records from Kandahar province and Helmand province and whatnot on my computer screen while the plane was still in flight from Bagram with the injured people aboard. And there's nothing like that in civilian medicine. There's a lot we can learn from your world, and I wish there was more of that learning going in that direction. Civilian medicine tends to have an ego that it's better than military medicine, and what I learned in Landstuhl is that it's not. Greg, I was glad to hear you mention the Stop the Bleed program. It had been part of my intention as I got up here to comment on that, to comment on that particular program. This is a national program modeled after the CPR program. It's free training. Everyone in this room that had the interest to come here should have the interest to spend an hour and a half at your local fire department or elsewhere learning the Stop the Bleed training to do this. And this may be the largest single advance out of the Afghanistan war, and I'm sure Dr. Lounsbury, better than I, could catalog, World War I transfusions, World War II antibiotics, Vietnam, Da Nang lung and ICU care, Korea, the first real vascular surgical reconstructions, Norman Rich and the vascular registry, et cetera, et cetera. I've probably said enough, but I certainly do commend the Stop the Bleed program. My final comment would be that in my short time in Landstuhl, I've taken care of a lot of patients. I'm just about your age, Dave, in this country, and some of them real sick and some of them not so sick. And I'll tell you, there's certain attitudes that you get from hospitalized, well-treated first world patients. You don't see that in the soldiers. And I took care of people who looked a lot like Greg when he came in, and I have never been treated with such gratitude and appreciation by any patients in my life as I was by your colleagues, Greg.
Yeah, just like everyone else, thank you for your time tonight. I'm so grateful for being here. My name's Tom. I'm a Marine vet, and it does feel like coming home. I wish all the seats in here were filled. It should be that way. And frankly, this should be broadcasted and sent throughout America, a requirement of every American citizen to watch this. My question is, it's actually directed to all of you. I think you'd all provide different answers that we benefit from. What does a model society look like for returning wounded, ill, and injured service members looking to reintegrate and reacclimate to this society? And by model, I mean, I know that's a difficult question, probably longer than what we have, but what are the attributes? What are the behaviors that people show? What are the services provided? Dr. Iaccarino mentioned some of those via home base, the last question that she took. Just curious what all your answers would be.
All right, I'll start. So I don't know if I know what the ideal society would look like for a returning military service member, but I can tell you that having people like all of you who maybe are not service members, people like me who aren't service members, understand or have some basic knowledge around both the very visible and the very invisible wounds of war, and how those things impact people's daily lives is maybe a good first step into how society might be able to do better for people coming back. So we've been training first responders here in Boston about how to recognize the symptoms of PTSD, depression, anxiety, TBI in people they meet on the street, right? First responders come upon a guy who's living homelessly on the street, and he says, "Don't touch me," and "Don't get anywhere near me." And, is that somebody who's psychotic? Is that somebody who has severe PTSD? And that person deserves, treatment and respect and understanding that we as civilians don't have necessarily. So a lot of awareness and a healthy dose of compassion might be a really good start, in my opinion.
Can I ask a question before I give a partial answer? How many veterans are there in the room? Can you hold up your arm? Yeah, it's like that a lot when we have these. We get a big ratio. Doctor, you mentioned the people you treated were more expressive of gratitude than those who were veterans, those who were actually still in the service, but before they were discharged.
What I was trying to say was that I can take care of, I've got to be careful here, that I can take care of coddled Americans with minor problems who are more angry about their medical care than someone like Greg was, who we were working our butts off to bring him through, and someone like Greg was nothing but grateful, and it brought you to tears.
And that's helpful, because that's going to go right to my point. With the cohort, when you're in a military unit, that's why I asked who are veterans, because you'll nod at this, the bonds that you form with the people overseas in dangerous settings, in combat in some cases, but sometimes not, in the hardship, and the privation, and the social isolation, the loneliness, the bonds that you form with those people, and the sense of identity you have with them may be stronger than any you form at any time in your life. Spouses might not understand this. Families might not understand it. There's a sense of belonging to something that's incredibly intense and bonding. And then you're also dealing with young people who have generally a positive outlook. These are people who've really accomplished a lot. By the time you get out to a line platoon like Greg, you've gone through a lot of training, you've gone over a lot of obstacles, you've volunteered repeatedly, right up to, in Greg's case, volunteering to take a platoon after the previous platoon leader was killed. That profile of person is what, when you come home from war, you're often missing. You're suddenly cast into the civilian society that you, doctor, just described, that's rat racing or distracting or busy, and what you miss are those bonds. And so I think the ideal thing, people I've seen do well, I've really become very close over time with many, many combat veterans, people I knew from my own service, people I then knew in Iraq and Afghanistan and have stayed in touch with across now decades. Those who have done well adjusting find these bonds. They belong to something, whether it's a church, a music group, their family, they have a particularly strong spouse or children or parents, they find something. So my ideal society is very intimate. It surrounds the person with a sense of belonging to something just themselves. But you come out of that, one of the great traumas that after the physical trauma is this loneliness. You come out of this intense connectivity that you have in the military, and you're cast into a society that largely doesn't understand you at all, because we don't have a draft. There's no longer service is no longer randomized. It's all self-selected. So you're very alone. That's one of the things we try to do on At War, is just to keep these kinds of discussions happening, like trying to create like just a glimmer of awareness about these things, because we know how many of you feel utterly alone, unless you have a super strong family. That's my answer. Now it's your turn, Dave.
Mine's almost counter. Not counter, because I agree with everything you just said. But you asked what a question. What's the model society that you would want the soldier to come back to? I think it's too late. I think we've lost it. In World War II, at the peak of World War II, 1 in 10 Americans served. In this war, it's less than 1 in 100. I actually balk a little bit at this "thank you for your service." I don't want to cause a problem. I don't like it. Nobody held a gun to my head and made me go. I just told you, every time I had a chance to get out, I stayed. I mean, it's an all-volunteer force. And each decade of it, it gets to be a smaller and smaller club that has its own language, its own parties, its own traditions, and a little bit of resentment to those outside it. And so you're asking what would be better, what society would be better for them to come back to? You know, my brother deserves "thank you for your service." And the reason I think he deserved it is because he was drafted. Now, somebody's going to correct me and say, no, you said he was a Marine. No, he was drafted. And in all days, not just those days, when you get drafted into the Army. Not the Navy, not the Air Force, not the Coast Guard, not the Marines. You were drafted into the Army. And he got his draft notice. I remember him bringing it home to the supper table. And he wanted my father to impress my father. It's a long story I won't bore you with. But so what does he do? He picks up the draft notices, walks down the street in Boston, and joins the Marines. Look what that got him. He's a triple amputee 10 months later. But my point is, he was drafted. He didn't want to go to Vietnam, as far as I know. I don't know. He sure as heck didn't want to wind up as he did. And so he deserves congratulations for his service. Yes, thank you for your service, Guy. Greg deserves, and many thousands deserves, thank you for your sacrifice. But I'm not being modest here. I'm not a modest. Don't thank me. I would thank you back. Thank you for staying home and paying taxes and raising a family and doing good things. And so I'll finish, honest, I promise. What's the ideal society to go? We don't have it, and we're not about to reinstitute the draft unless you know something I don't know. So I think the society has an irreparable problem there. And I'm not sure I want the draft to come back, but if you don't do that, if you don't engage the general public in the sacrifice of war, then the ideal society that you're groping for, it will never occur. Nobody's experiencing. Chris just said that. We were told to go shopping, that we weren't levied with a tax. Every other war, you get taxed for it. You paid taxes. There is no tax for this war. It's all accumulating a huge debt. It's free of charge for us to have this war go on 20 years. And so the Joe public that the soldiers coming back to can't relate to Greg or to my brother. And I'll stop. I think it's broken, and it's not soon to be fixed. And I don't think I don't know what the answer to your question would be, and I can't imagine it happening anytime soon.
Greg.
I got a smile on my face, and there's one thing that I agree with from Dave's very dark outlook and depressing outlook on our country. I will say that our country's got a lot of problems, but this country's still a damn good country worth fighting for and worth sacrificing for. The one thing that I will agree with Dave about that that I'll tiptoe around here is that the thank you for your service. I think if that's all that people can do, by all means. We've been in much worse places in our history. Hearing the stories, I've heard countless Vietnam vets come tell me about how they were treated when they came back. So from those regards, coming back to a public that's, in my mind, sometimes the pendulums swing almost too far, that, oh, you're a veteran, thank you for this. People of us is entitled, we expect our veterans discounts and what have you. What I tell people is the ideal, rather than saying thank you for your service to me, you can thank me for my service, is by doing your part to make a difference, make the world a better place, make your community a better place. That's kind of the idea, for me, that's the ideal public to come back to. Serving your nation in the military is one of countless ways that you can make this country and your community and this world a better place. But it could be anything from donating blood. Within the first 24 hours, I had over 45 units of blood. It was complete strangers I've never met in my life that helped save my life. You know, donating blood, mentoring an at-risk youth, picking up trash on the side of the road, donating your hours at a soup kitchen, donating your services somewhere. That's how you thank me and all the other vets out there, I think, for our service. I don't need to hear the fucking words. It's great. Thank you. Thank you for your support, man. I never really know what to say back, but, you know, cheers. God bless you. Hey, go Pats. I don't know. But that's how you thank me and everybody else for our service. If I come back to a public that they don't need to serve, I don't hold it against anybody that didn't go in the military. I don't hold it. No, it's not for everybody. I did my part. If I come back to a public that at least is making the world a better place in whatever small way they can, that's the ideal society I come back. We're not going to be perfect, but this country is still worth fighting for. Fuck yeah.
We're going to do one more, and then we're out of time. I think we're probably going to have to pay more on the lease as it is. It's,
wait a minute.
Mike's in the back. So you know, we're out of time for this room, but what has happened at every one of these events afterward is at least some of us will go out. We've got to go turn in our microphones. It takes about 5 minutes, so we'll go out and meet you in the lobby and talk to you and stay to answer any more questions if we didn't get to you. I don't, yes.
Excuse me.
I think he's got the microphone there.
Go ahead.
So, I spent some time a few days ago with some veterans and with people who work with veterans. And one of the things that seems to be the hardest is exactly what Dr. Lounsbury pointed out, is that the citizens of this country really are not exposed to war or to the problems of veterans because they have no stake in the game. Their sons and daughters aren't necessarily going to be drafted or volunteer. The Congress people do not have sons and daughters who are going into the military. Maybe some do, but it's not. And they are ruling. They are, well, I hope they're not ruling our country, I guess. But they send our youth to war, but they have no gut understanding of it. And so that's what I've been struggling with. If I wanted to make...
Do you have a question for the panel?
Yeah, I want to know how to engage civilians with veterans in a way that would allow them to understand. And that's not your problem, that's our problem, basically.
Maybe I should take one, because it goes back, I take that because it goes back to the beginning of what I said. You know, you guys came because you care. I've worked in this public lane for decades now, you know, probably 20 years as a journalist, and before that I was a Marine for almost 7 years, and you know, I have found very little engagement, and I'm, like you, very frustrated with it. Just like we didn't have an answer for what does an ideal society look like. I mean, Greg came close, but I don't have an answer for how we can get more engagement on these issues. You know, it used to be when we threw the newspaper up on the porch of the subscribers, or when people took it out of the honor boxes on the street corner, nobody knew what was read in the newspaper. They knew the sale of the unit. One newspaper was sold, you know, to 20 Main Street today, but they didn't know what was read. Now with the internet, we know what's read, right? Because all your footprints out there are inventoried. We know what you look at. We know how long you stay on an article. We know how many times you visit. We know what you don't look at very much. And I mean, I'm not a metrics person. Lauren can vouch. I argue against metrics a lot because I think it can lead you towards just giving people what they want. A cotton candy newspaper, no vegetables in it. But what we find, I've found, is that, you know, these stories that you would like to read are not read as much as a lot of other stuff. So we don't know what the answer is. We created this space. I mean, we rented this room, but we've generally created the space on our website and hired a couple of veterans and hired Lauren to try to further these discussions because we thought the discussion was underserved. But, you know, we're not the food section. We're not the sports section. We're not the stock page. We don't get the traffic. We get a lot of traffic, but compared to many of the other issues, and that's even leaving the president out, who's, you know, he's an engine of traffic for reasons you know. But we don't get the traffic. We don't know where the engagement lies. The last conversation we did like this with the public was about whether or not we should have a draft. Because if we had a mail lottery that determined who went to the military service, you know, the question is, would more people pay attention if, you know, your nephew or niece or your kids might be drafted? Would there be more attention? Or do we live in a place where, you know, the thing you don't have to worry about is the thing you don't think about? And war is something Americans do not have to worry about serving in unless they volunteer. So I don't have an answer except to say we're trying. I mean, we could probably get 100 people in the room tonight. That's not bad. I'll take that. We'll start with this. But we don't know, you know, how to write a story about veterans reintegration that performs as well as a recipe about hollandaise sauce. You know, sadly. We'll be out in the hallway in a few minutes. Thanks.